بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. To continue inshallah with where we left off prior to Ramadan, we alhamdulillah completed the asrar of Kitab al-Tahara and the asrar of Kitab al-Salah, and so now inshallah we're going to start al-Kitab al-Khamis asrar al-Zakah from the Muhadhab of Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala's Ihya. And the purpose behind this book, of course, although Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he does delve into the fiqh aspect when he's speaking about the ahkam al-khamsa, we're not going to really look at that side. We're going to focus on the more internal, spiritual and developmental side, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. So he says, makanatu zakah. So he starts with the position and the importance of zakah within the framework of Islam. He says, جعل الله تعالى الزكاة إحدى مباني الإسلام وأردف بذكرها الصلاة التي هي أعلى الأعلام فقال تعالى وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة. So he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made zakah one of the foundational pillars of Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala usually or at times follows as-salah up with az-zakah. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and establish the prayer and give the zakah. And Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he says, وَهِيَ i.e. as-salah أعلى الأعلام. It is the pinnacle and peak of worship and the most important part of the application of Islam, the physical application of Islam after the shahadatain, as-salah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala usually couples the salah with zakah, which shows its significance and its importance. And then he says, وقال النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام بني الإسلام على خمس شهادة أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة الحديث. So he says, the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام likewise, he mentioned that the framework of Islam has been built upon 5 things, i.e. there are 5 pillars to Islam. The one who does not have these pillars has no Islam if they are able to have these pillars. The first, ash-shahadatain, to testify to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that the Prophet ﷺ is his last and final messenger. And I believe we touched upon it, and he has an entire chapter on this that we're going to go into later on, inshallah. But what does it mean, the shahadatain? It means that not only do we say it with our tongues, but we say it with our hearts, i.e. we do not attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anyone else, firstly and foremostly. Secondly, when we testify to the fact that the Prophet ﷺ is the last and final messenger, i.e. his way of life is the best way of life in every aspect. And then he says, وَإِقَامِ الصَّلَاةِ, to give the prayer, وَإِيتَاءِ الزَّكَاةِ, and to establish the prayer and to give the zakah. And so these 3 in particular, the shahadatain, the salah and the zakah, if a person does not pray, then their Islam is in danger. If a person does not give the zakah and they are able to do so, then there is a danger there when it comes to their Islam. And the shahadatain, of course, without the shahadatain there is no Islam. And then he says, وشدد الوعيد على المقصرين فيها فقال والذين يكنزون الذهب والفضة ولا ينفقونها في سبيل الله فبشرهم بعذاب أليم. He says, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was very explicit and severe in relation to those who do not give the zakah and they are able to do so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, those who they hold on to and they hoard that which is eligible for zakah, such as gold and silver, and they do not spend it in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give them the word here, فَبَشِّرْهُمْ, we sometimes translate it as glad tidings, but of course it's not glad tidings, but inform them that they have a painful punishment. And so if we were to just think about the importance of zakah for a second prior to carrying on, and the role that zakah can have in society, we have amongst us, the Muslim communities, millionaires and perhaps billionaires. I'm talking about in the UK. Or let's say in Europe, because I'm not sure if we have billionaire Muslims in the UK. I think we may have. But for certain, we have millionaires, quite a few millionaires, alhamdulillah. And if we extend it to Europe, then we have billionaires. If we extend it globally, then perhaps even trillionaires. Allahu A'lam. Some of the rulers and the kings and so on and so forth, whether or not that wealth actually should be in their bank accounts and pockets, it's another topic of discussion. But if we were to imagine that those who are supposed to be giving zakah gave zakah, what would the world look like today? If the Muslims in the UK alone gave zakah, I'm pretty certain that the poverty that exists in the UK would no longer exist if we were to give zakah properly. But many of us, we find loopholes and we try to avoid giving zakah and so on and so forth. And we're going to look at this shortly, inshallah. But the zakah, it prevents society from becoming that which we are seeing society becoming today, where there is a significant disparity between the wealthy and the impoverished, where you are starting to have a monopolization of wealth by a certain part of society and extreme poverty lines in other parts of society. And so zakah is very important. And those who can give zakah and they're not giving zakah need to understand the significance of what they're doing. It's not only something which belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. it's not only Allah's right, it's the right of the society that the person lives in to give zakah. And then the author rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam Ghazali, he says, وَمَعْنَى الْإِنفَاقِ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ إِخْرَاجُ حَقِّ الزَّكَاةِ. And the meaning of spending in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in this particular verse means to give that which they are supposed to give of zakah. Then he says, قال أبو ذر انتهيت إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو جالس في ظل الكعبة فلما رآني قال هم الأخسرون ورب الكعبة. So Abu Dhar, the companion, he said, I came to the Prophet ﷺ and he was sitting in the shade of the Kaaba. And when he saw me, he said, they are the ones of severe loss by the Lord of the Kaaba. I.e. the Prophet ﷺ swore by the Lord of the Kaaba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, they are the ones of severe loss. فَقُلْتُ Abu Dhar, he said, who? Sorry, I've skipped it a bit. He said, Abu Dhar, من هم? Who are they? قال الأكثرون أموالا إلا من قال هكذا وهكذا وهكذا من بين يديه ومن خلفه وعن يمينه وعن شماله. He said, those who have a large amount of wealth, except for the ones who spend. And the Prophet ﷺ started to move his hands in this manner and that manner and that manner, etc. The hadith specifies that he on his right, his left, in front of him and behind him. The Prophet ﷺ gestured while saying, except those who spend like this and like this and like this and like that, or give in that manner. وَقَلِيلٌ مَا هُمْ, and very few of the wealthy are like this. I.e. most of the wealthy people are those who do not spend accordingly, the way that they should. ما من صاحب إبل ولا بقر ولا غنم لا يؤدي زكاتها إلا جاءت يوم القيامة أعظم ما كانت وأسمنه تنطحه بقرونها وتطؤه بأطلافها كلما نفذت أخراها عادت أولاها حتى يقضى بين الناس. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the owner of cows and camels and goats or sheep, etc., who does not give from that which he should be giving, as these are zakatable, they are eligible for zakat. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, the animals that he owned will come and they will be larger and stockier in size, and they will continue to butt him with their horns and to stample on him with their hooves until the judgment between the people starts. Once the last of them finishes, the first of them will come back to continue the cycle. That's for the one who owns animals, etc. Then he says, وَفِي الْكِتَابِ أَرْبَعَةُ فُصُولٍ. In this particular section of the book, there are 4 areas, 4 chapters. الأول في أنواع الزكاة وأسباب وجوبها. The first is the various types of zakah and the reasons for their wujub, their obligation. الثاني أداؤها وشروطها الباطنة والظاهرة. The second chapter, the way that the zakah should be given and the prerequisites for giving the zakah and that includes that which is internal and external. As we said, this book, we're focusing on the internal, which is not the area of the fuqaha. Then he says, الثالث في القابض وشروط استحقاقه وآداب قبضه. The third chapter is in relation to the one who takes the zakah and the conditions of his eligibility to take the zakah, and likewise the etiquettes of taking zakah. والرابع في الصدقة التطوع وفضلها. And the fourth chapter is in voluntary sadaqah, voluntary giving, and its virtue. And so the first chapter, as he goes into the fiqh of zakah, we're not going to go into the details. Why? Because it's not a fiqh class, number one. Number two, Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, as we said, he was an imam in usul, imam in fiqh, imam in aqidah, imam in lugha, in tazkiyah, in suluk, and so on and so forth. But he is basing the fiqh on the framework of the Shafi'i school. And I haven't studied the Shafi'i school formally, number one. And number two, there are differences of opinions in relation to some of these. And so we'll leave the fiqh for a fiqh class, inshallah. But we'll just mention the main forms of zakah that Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala mentions. So he says, النوع الأول زكاة النعم. So الفصل الأول في أنواع الزكاة. So the types of zakah. He says, النوع الأول زكاة النعم أو الأنعام. The zakah which relates to animals which a person owns, i.e. cows, sheep, goats, camels, etc. They are eligible for zakah. In accordance to the amount owned, there is a particular amount that should be given, and so on and so forth. Then he says, النوع الثاني زكاة المعشرات. The second type of zakah is the zakah, which is basically you have to give a portion of that which you own, a tenth, or that which is of significant value in accordance to that. Which again, we're not going to go into the details right now. He says النوع الرابع زكاة التجارة. The zakah of trade. So the person who has stocks, etc. The person who owns properties for sale, regardless what they are, those properties are. And I don't mean properties, i.e. houses, and no, anything. A person who owns things that they have purchased for the sake of sale, they have to give zakah. How do they give zakah, etc.? Again, leave it for fiqh. النوع الخامس الركاز والمعدن. The fifth type, basically treasures and precious metals that are discovered in the ground. There is a type of zakah that has to be given from these things, which, as I said, we're not going to go into now. And there are certain conditions. So, for example, if a person in his garden is digging up and finds a treasure which has come from a past nation prior to the nation of Islam, our nation, and there are clear signs on it, etc., they have to give zakah. What type of land is it that they find it in, etc., discussed in the books of fiqh. النوع السادس صدقة الفطر. The sixth type of zakah, صدقة الفطر. So the zakah which is given at the end of Ramadan, the sadaqah which is given, which is obligatory upon a person who meets the criteria for giving it, etc. And then he goes on to الفصل الثاني في الأداء وشروطه الباطنة والظاهرة. Then he says the second chapter is al-ada, so how zakah is to be given, and the external and internal conditions for giving zakah. So as for the external conditions, we're not going to go into them. As I said, we're not going into the fiqh. So we're going to come to al-adab wal-batina fi zakah. So the etiquettes that are internal, or the conditions that may be considered conditions internally. He says, اعلم أن على مريد طريق الآخرة بزكاته وظائف. He says, know that the person who is trying to traverse the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure, i.e. the path of the akhirah, with his zakah, he has to have certain etiquettes that he follows. He says, الأولى فهم وجوب الزكاة وأنها من مباني الإسلام وفيه ثلاث معان. He says the first is to understand the obligation of zakah, and that it is from the principal foundations of Islam. And in that there are three particular areas that need to be looked at. He says, المعنى الأول أن التلفظ بكلمتي الشهادة التزام للتوحيد وشهادة بإفراد المعبود وشرط تمام الوفاء به ألا يبقى للموحد محبوب سوى الواحد الفرد، فإن المحبة لا تقبل الشرك، والتوحيد باللسان قليل الجدوى، وإنما يمتحن به درجة المحب بمفارقة المحبوب. He says, the first thing that we have to understand about zakah is that the zakah relates to the shahadatain. When I give zakah, it relates to the shahadatain. When I say ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, my giving of zakah has an implication in that. How so? He says, when you say the shahadatain, you are testifying that there is nothing worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Muhammad is the last and final messenger, of course. But in order to have a complete testification of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the heart is supposed to be free of love for anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the pinnacle of testifying to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It starts with testifying that there's no deity worthy of being worshipped except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and not attributing partners to Him. But the end goal that a person wants to aspire towards and try to achieve is that his heart has no love inside it, true love, except for the love that he has for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or we can say that the love that he has for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like any other love. Because of course, it's not possible to have a heart free of natural love and so on and so forth. And he says that testifying to this with your tongue, it's not enough. It's not enough. It doesn't provide sufficient indication of the love that you have for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart. And so a person is tested, the trueness of his words are tested by giving from that which he loves for the sake of the one he truly loves. And then he says, وَالْأَمْوَالُ مَحْبُوبَةٌ عِنْدَ الْخَلَائِقِ لِأَنَّهَا آلَةَ تَمَتُّعِهِمْ بِالدُّنْيَا وبسببها يأنسون بهذا العالم وينفرون عن الموت مع أن فيه لقاء المحبوب. He says, and wealth, the types of wealth, various types of wealth, whether it's currency, whether it's that which we trade with, and so on and so forth, they are beloved to us and they are endeared to us. Why? Because with them we enjoy the pleasures of this life, and by their means we acquire the comfort of this life, and we incline towards this life whilst we turn away from the akhirah. Because of our love that we have for the wealth of this life, we incline towards it and we don't want to leave it. And we turn away from death, which in reality is the door to meeting who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is supposed to be the one that we truly love. So then he says, فَامْتُحِنُوا بِتَصْدِيقِ دَعْوَاهُمْ فِي الْمَحْبُوبِ. And for that reason, the trueness of what they are saying with their tongue, i.e. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, that I only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is tested in their wealth. Are they able to give from that which they love for the sake of the one who they should truly love? And then he says, وَاسْتُنْزِلُوا عَنِ الْمَالِ الَّذِي هُوَ مَرْمُوقُهُمْ وَمَعْشُوقُهُمْ وَلِذَلِكَ قال الله تعالى إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. And so they are tested and they are forced to, or they are separated from their wealth, i.e. that which is beloved to them, for the sake of the shahada, to see the truthfulness of it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that Allah has purchased from the believers their selves and their wealth for what? For the price of paradise. That the believers trade with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They trade with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they barter with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What are they purchasing? Paradise. And before paradise comes what? The love and pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As no person can enter paradise unless Allah is pleased with him. And how do they purchase this place in paradise? With their lives and with their wealth. And in other parts of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts with the selling of their wealth before their lives. And so He says, وَذَلِكَ بِالْجِهَادِ, i.e. in this particular verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about jihad. sacrificing one's soul. He says, وهو مسامحة بالمهجة شوقا إلى لقاء الله عز وجل والمسامحة بالمال أهون. He says that this particular verse refers to those who give up their lives in the struggle, sacrifice their lives in the struggle to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever that struggle looks like. And so, for example, perhaps we can refer back to the people of Gaza today, the people of Palestine today. They are sacrificing their lives, literally, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from them. And then he says, وَالْمُسَامَحَةُ بِالْمَالِ أَهْوَنُ. And so to sacrifice your wealth for the sake of proving your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is easier. It's easier to do. And interestingly, the word musamaha in Arabic, musamaha, for those of you that speak Arabic, you've probably heard of it, I'm sure. Musamaha can also be used to mean forgive. You can say al-musamaha means al-afu. Samahtuka, afawt ank, for example. I have forgiven you. I've overlooked your mistake. If someone comes, you've offended a person, you can say samihni. You can say forgive me, overlook my mistake. So what's the link? And musamaha also means badal. It also means literally to sacrifice. So what's the link between sacrificing, badlu shay, to sacrifice something, to give something, to exert something, and to forgive? What's the link between the two? Anyone know or can take a guess? Because Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he could have said وهو ببذل المهجة أو بالبذل بالروح, because the al-muhja means the ruh, the soul. So why is it that he used the term musamaha? What's the link between exerting, sacrificing, giving, and forgiving? Is there a link between the two? Huh? Yeah, both are coming from the heart. What else?
It's like a struggle against the nafs to forgive someone as well.
Exactly. When you forgive someone, you have to give from yourself. When you forgive someone, you have to give from yourself. It's like you're giving sadaqah. It's like you're taking something that is beloved to you and giving, especially if the person's hurt your ego. If the person's hurt your ego. I'll give you an example that some may unfortunately relate to. You just purchased a new pair of trainers, white, 200 and something pounds. Some of you that might be cheap, 400 pounds. And a person walks along, muddy shoes, steps on them. And they look down, they say, oh, forgive me. It hurts. You have to give something to them to forgive them. You may not be physically giving them something, but you're giving them something from inside of you. And so it's like sacrifice. Musamaha is sacrifice. And so the concept of jihad, it's like zakah. Why? Because you are sacrificing that which is most precious to you, your soul, for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, zakah. Zakah, you are sacrificing that which is pleasing to you, your wealth. When you look at your bank account, prior to all of your bills having to be paid, of course, you're pleased to see the numbers in your bank account. So giving, it's a form of showing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I love you more than I love this dunya. And so for that reason, it shouldn't be a burden. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he's saying it shouldn't be a burden. It should be something that we want to do. Why? Because we're showing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala our love for him. And then he says, وَلَمَّا فُهِمَ هَذَا الْمَعْنَى فِي بَذْلِ الْأَمْوَالِ انقسم الناس إلى ثلاثة أقسام. He says, and if we have understood this particular meaning, then we can look at the categories of people when it comes to giving from their wealth. The people are of three types. And I think we'll leave that inshallah, just because I don't want to end abruptly. So my apologies, I think today was quite short. So inshallah, hopefully someone asks a good question and we have a long, interesting discussion. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.